I found out I was a freeloader the same way everyone else did, on Facebook. My brother posted it publicly, confidently, as if he were finally correcting a long-standing injustice. I read his words in silence, sitting alone in a room I had just rented, realizing how easily decades of support can be rewritten into a punchline. I moved out on a Tuesday morning, the kind that feels unfinished even after noon. The house was quiet in a way it hadn't been for years. Not peaceful, just emptied of obligation. I packed only what I needed. Clothes folded the way I always had, careful not to wrinkle anything that no longer belonged to me. I wiped the kitchen counter after myself out of habit, even though I knew I would not be returning to cook another meal there. Robert was not home. He rarely was in the mornings. He said work mattered more than routine, though he had never noticed who kept the routine standing. I left my keys on the hallway table, beside the bowl where I had placed them for decades. For a moment, I stood there, looking at that small circle of wooden glass, and wondered how something so ordinary could hold so much weight. No one stopped me. No one asked if I needed help. My mother had watched from the doorway earlier, arms folded, expression distant. My father sat in his chair, eyes fixed on the television, nodding occasionally as if agreement required no words. There was no scene. Just the quiet understanding that my usefulness had expired. By the afternoon, I was settled into a small rental across town. Nothing special. Clean. Silent. I unpacked slowly, placing things where I could find them later. I made tea and sat by the window, letting the unfamiliar stillness settle into my bones. That was when my phone began to vibrate. At first, I ignored it. Then it buzzed again. And again. A neighbor's name appeared. Then a cousin's. Then someone I hadn't spoken to in years. Confused, I opened the first notification. It was Robert's Facebook post. A photo of the front of the house I had just left, brightened by a filter that made everything look warmer than it had ever been. Beneath it, his words sat confidently, as if rehearsed. Finally, the freeloader is gone. Some people don't know when it's time to move on. The reactions came fast. Laughing faces. Thumbs up. Comments praising his patience, his strength, his generosity for putting up with it for so long. Someone wrote that it was about time. Another said the house would finally breathe again. I read every word once. Then I set the phone face down on the table. I did not comment. I did not defend myself. I did not explain the years I paid the bills when others could not, the appointments I scheduled, the debts I quietly covered, the stability I provided without announcement. None of that translated well on social media anyway. There is no button for invisible labor. No reaction icon for endurance. By evening, the post had spread further than I expected. Friends of friends weighed in. People who had eaten at my table spoke about me as if I were a burden they had personally carried. My mother liked the post. My father shared it privately with relatives. I made myself soup and ate alone. The silence in the room did not feel hostile. It felt honest. Later that night, I picked up my phone one last time and scrolled through the comments again. Not to hurt myself. To confirm something I already understood. Robert believed the story ended once I walked out the door. I knew better. Leaving was not the ending. It was the moment the balance stopped holding. I did not become invisible overnight. It happened slowly, the way dust settles on furniture no one thinks to move anymore. By the time my brother felt confident enough to mock me publicly, I had already been fading for years, quietly, obediently, without protest. I was the one who stayed when others left. When my parents aged and routines grew fragile, I adjusted my life without discussion. I managed appointments, refilled prescriptions, paid small bills that never came with receipts or gratitude. Groceries appeared. Repairs were handled. Emergencies softened before they reached panic. I never announced what I covered or corrected anyone when they assumed things simply worked out. My brother noticed this absence of noise and mistook it for absence of value. Robert had always been louder. His contributions arrived with explanations and witnesses. If he paid for dinner once, it became a story told repeatedly. If he handled a single errand, my mother mentioned it to relatives as proof of devotion. Visibility, I learned, mattered more than consistency. And because I did not compete for attention, my role became background. My mother relied on me without acknowledging reliance. She spoke as though my presence was expected, not chosen. You don't mind, she would say, already moving on to the next request. When Robert expressed opinions, she listened. When I made decisions quietly to keep the household steady, she accepted the outcome without question, as though it were natural law rather than effort. Silence, in our family, was interpreted as dependency. The less I spoke about what I carried, the more they assumed I carried nothing. I became the one who was around, not the one who contributed. Over time, that perception hardened. If I disagreed, I was reminded how much Robert did. If I hesitated, I was told I was lucky to have support. The truth, that the structure stood because I stayed still beneath it, was inconvenient. Generational expectations made this easy to overlook. A woman's labor was considered part of her character, not her contribution. You did not count it. You absorbed it. And when it became too familiar, it became invisible. By the time I moved out, my absence felt to them like relief, not loss. They believed I depended on the household when, in reality, the household had adjusted itself around my quiet endurance. That misunderstanding would soon reveal itself. Not through argument. Not through explanation. But through the sudden weight of what no longer held. I did not leave after a fight. There was no final argument to point to, no door slammed in anger. What pushed me out was quieter than that, an accumulation of small displacements that, taken alone, sounded harmless. It began with my father speaking to me less directly. Conversations happened around me, not with me. Decisions about the house, repairs, finances, visits, were discussed as though I were a temporary guest rather than someone who had lived within those walls for decades. When I offered input, it was acknowledged politely and then set aside. You don't need to worry about that anymore, my father said once, not unkindly, when I asked about a utility bill I had always managed. At first, I thought he meant to ease my burden. Only later did I understand it was a rehearsal for absence. My room changed without discussion. Storage boxes appeared. A cabinet I used was reassigned. My things were shifted to make space for items my brother wanted to keep at home. Each change was minor, reasonable when explained. Together, they formed a message I was expected to receive without comment. One afternoon, my father stood in the doorway while I folded laundry and said, almost casually, that Robert had been talking about fresh starts and moving forward as a family. He did not look at me when he spoke. He spoke as though the future he imagined had already decided who belonged in it. You're independent, he added, as if that settled something. You'll be fine. It was not reassurance. It was a conclusion. No one asked me what I wanted. No one suggested alternatives. The expectation was that I would recognize the direction things were moving and step aside gracefully. I was being edged out by implication, not force. By courtesy, not confrontation. The house felt different after that. Not hostile. Just less mine. Meals were quieter. My presence felt tolerated rather than assumed. When I sat in the living room, conversations paused, then resumed with a careful distance. I began to feel like a reminder of something they no longer wished to account for. My father never told me to leave. He did not have to. His silences did the work for him. So I began preparing quietly. I sorted my belongings in stages. I arranged what needed arranging. I did not announce plans or seek permission. I moved with the same restraint I had always practiced, careful not to disturb what was already shifting. On the morning I left, my father stood in the hallway and said he hoped I understood. I told him I did. What I did not say was that understanding did not make it easier. It only made it clearer. As I closed the door behind me, there was no sense of relief. Only an unease I could not yet name, an awareness that something essential had been misjudged, and that the cost of that mistake had not yet surfaced. They never asked how things worked. For years, systems ran quietly because I made them run. Not through authority or recognition, but through routine. The electricity stayed on. The water bill was never late. Insurance renewals arrived before deadlines. Statements were filed, folders labeled, numbers checked twice. Nothing dramatic. Nothing worth praise, apparently. Things simply functioned, which made my presence seem optional. Invisible labor does not announce itself. It hides inside normalcy. I knew which utility offered a senior discount and which one required annual re-verification. I knew which bill could be delayed without penalty and which one could not. I kept track of service numbers, account logins, escalation paths, small details that prevented bigger problems. When something went wrong, it rarely reached crisis because I addressed it before anyone else noticed. Paperwork lived in a system only I understood because no one had ever asked to learn it. Files were organized by habit, not instruction. If a letter came marked urgent, it landed on my side of the table by default. I did not claim that role. It was assigned to me gradually, through neglect. When my brother spoke about finances, he spoke in broad terms: who paid what, who earned more, who deserved credit. He never spoke about processes. My mother believed stability came from authority. My father believed it came from keeping the peace. Neither asked how stability was maintained day to day. I handled it quietly. That was my mistake. Silence, over time, becomes proof of irrelevance. Because I never reminded anyone of what I did, they assumed it required no effort, or worse, that it required no one at all. I remembered the last winter before I left. A billing error nearly shut off the heat during a cold snap. I spent an afternoon on the phone correcting it. When the problem was resolved, no one noticed because the house stayed warm. That was the pattern. Success erased evidence of work. When I moved out, I did not transfer responsibilities. No one asked me to. They assumed the systems would continue on their own, the way they always had. Like a machine that runs forever once started. I packed my files carefully. I did not remove anything abruptly. I closed accounts tied to my name. I updated mailing addresses. I left what belonged to them and took only what had always been mine, knowledge included. This was not punishment. It was accuracy. As I settled into my new place, I noticed how light my days felt. Not empty, lighter. The absence of constant monitoring freed something in me. I still paid bills. I still kept records. I simply did it for myself. They did not call at first. Why would they? Nothing had broken yet. Systems fail slowly when the person holding them together steps away without announcement. The first signs are subtle. A missed notice. A delayed payment. A question no one knows how to answer. They never asked how things worked. They were about to learn what happens when something essential is mistaken for expendable. The first signs did not arrive loudly. They arrived as questions. My brother noticed a letter on the kitchen counter with unfamiliar formatting. He read it twice before setting it down, convinced it belonged to someone else. When my mother asked what it was, he waved it away and said it was nothing important. That had always been his approach: assume stability, dismiss interruption. A week later, another envelope arrived. This one did not get ignored. It mentioned a late fee. The amount was small, almost insulting in its modesty, but the tone was firm. Systems, when they begin to falter, do not shout. They correct. My mother called him into the room. Her voice was careful, already preparing to soften the problem before naming it. She asked if he had paid the utility bill. He said yes without checking. He had always said yes without checking. The online version of him remained unchanged. On Facebook, he posted about responsibility, about how hard it was to carry others, about finally having peace in the house. People responded with approval. Thumbs up icons, supportive comments. They praised his firmness. They congratulated him for setting boundaries, a phrase he had learned recently and enjoyed repeating. Offline, the house felt different. Lights flickered once in the hallway. Not enough to alarm anyone, just enough to unsettle. My mother stood longer than usual at the mailbox, flipping through envelopes as if answers might be printed on the outside. She began leaving notes on the counter, questions written in pencil, erased and rewritten. Robert grew louder in private. He complained about inefficiency, about companies making mistakes, about how difficult it was to get help when you needed it. He did not yet consider that the problem was absence rather than error. He complained publicly again, too. Another post, this time framed as humor. Something about learning the hard way that nothing runs itself. People laughed. They assumed exaggeration. He liked that assumption. The contrast sharpened daily. Online, he was confident, decisive, admired. Inside the house, he paced during phone calls, repeated himself to customer service representatives, and hung up abruptly when conversations did not go his way. He was unfamiliar with being corrected by systems that did not recognize tone or entitlement. My mother watched him with quiet concern. Authority had always soothed her. Watching it wobble unsettled her more than the missed payments themselves. Still, neither of them reached out to me. Pride delays recognition. Confusion often hides behind noise. The cracks were small, but they were multiplying. And once they appeared, they did not seal themselves. I learned about the changes indirectly. A neighbor mentioned seeing my brother pacing the driveway late one evening, phone pressed tight to his ear, his voice carrying frustration instead of authority. Another person asked me, gently, if everything was all right at the house. I said yes. Silence had become my default answer, not as avoidance, but as boundary. From a distance, I watched how pride behaves when it has an audience. Online, Robert remained composed. He shared old photographs, stories about resilience, reflections on family loyalty. Each post was careful, polished. He spoke about responsibility as if it were a title he had earned rather than a structure he had inherited. The approval continued. People rarely question confidence when it is displayed publicly. Privately, the house began to resist him. Small inconveniences accumulated. Appointments were missed because reminders had stopped appearing. Accounts required verification he did not have. Numbers he assumed were fixed shifted without warning. The systems I once maintained quietly did not collapse in protest, they simply continued without him. That, I would later realize, was the most unsettling part. Humiliation does not always come from exposure. Sometimes it comes from being ignored by the very mechanisms you once controlled through someone else. My brother had relied on my presence without naming it. He mistook my quiet competence for passivity. When I left, he assumed the order would remain. I did not correct him. This was not revenge. It was consequence. And consequences do not announce themselves. They arrive as delays, as unanswered calls, as procedures that refuse shortcuts. They are indifferent to pride. I noticed the shift in his tone during brief encounters. The certainty softened into irritation, then into something closer to disbelief. He looked at me once, as if expecting a reaction, an explanation, perhaps even an apology. I offered none. Observation does not require participation. There is a particular discomfort that comes from realizing control was never yours, only borrowed. I could see it settling into him slowly. His confidence began to sound rehearsed. His complaints grew repetitive. He spoke more, listened less. Public pride remained intact. Private reality, however, was adjusting itself. I stayed silent, not because I had nothing to say, but because I understood something he did not yet grasp. Humiliation is most effective when it is self-inflicted. And the distance between how he presented himself and what he was experiencing was widening. Halfway through that realization, he posted again. Another declaration. Another attempt to frame the narrative. I closed the page without reacting. Some truths do not need witnesses. They only need time. The paperwork did not feel dramatic. It felt methodical, almost dull. That surprised me at first, because for years I had associated separation with confrontation, raised voices, and declarations made too late. This was none of that. This was quiet ink on clean pages. I sat at a small desk near the window, morning light resting on envelopes I had already opened and sorted. Utility accounts. Insurance notices. Bank correspondence that still arrived with my name attached, as if nothing had changed. I worked through them one by one, not with anger, but with clarity. Each obligation was addressed, redirected, or closed. No speeches. No explanations required. There is a misconception that disentangling oneself is an act of hostility. In reality, it is an act of accuracy. I was simply aligning responsibility with reality. I notified institutions in writing. Short letters, carefully worded. I was no longer a guarantor. No longer an emergency contact. No longer an informal administrator for matters that had never been officially mine, yet had always been expected of me. The language was neutral. Dates were precise. I kept copies of everything. Documentation has a calming effect when emotions are no longer allowed to lead. It removes ambiguity. It replaces memory with record. At no point did I feel the urge to inform my family of what I was doing. That, too, felt intentional. For years, I had been required to announce my usefulness in advance, to justify my presence through effort. This time, I allowed the system to communicate on my behalf. There is something sobering about realizing how much authority exists outside of conversation. Signatures carry weight. Timelines matter. Once set in motion, they do not respond to guilt or persuasion. They move forward steadily, unconcerned with who feels offended by the change. I did not rush. I reviewed each form twice. Accuracy mattered more than speed. This was not a withdrawal driven by impulse. It was the conclusion of a role I had never formally accepted, yet had fulfilled for decades. By the time I finished, the house I no longer lived in was no longer tied to me in any operational way. My name was absent where it had once been relied upon. The separation was complete, though no one else yet understood what that meant. I made tea afterward and sat quietly, not in relief, but in recognition. What I had done could not be undone by argument. It did not depend on anyone's approval. It simply existed now, filed and acknowledged. The inevitability of it felt calm. Almost kind. Some endings do not arrive with final words. They arrive as confirmations. The first call came in the early afternoon, when the house was quiet enough for the phone to sound louder than it should have. I recognized the number immediately. My mother rarely called during the day unless something had gone wrong, or unless she needed something handled quickly. I let it ring once longer than usual before answering. Her voice carried a practiced calm, the kind she used when she wanted to appear reasonable. She did not ask how I was settling in. She did not mention the post. She moved directly to the problem, as if that was the only language left between us. She said there was some confusion. Bills arriving that no one understood. Accounts behaving strangely. She asked, gently at first, if I had changed anything. I told her, just as gently, that I no longer managed household matters. There was a pause. Not shock, calculation. Then she said, "But you always did." I replied that I had. Past tense. I did not add anything else. The silence that followed was different from the ones before. It was heavier, less dismissive. She asked if I could just take a look, framed as a small favor, something temporary. I recognized the pattern immediately. Boundaries are often tested first as inconveniences. I declined. Politely. Without justification. She reminded me of my age, of how difficult change could be for everyone. She spoke as though responsibility were something assigned by longevity rather than consent. I listened, then repeated myself, calmly. I was no longer involved. When the call ended, I sat for a moment longer than necessary, noticing how my hands were steady. That felt new. The second call came later that evening. My father this time. His voice sounded tired, uncertain. He did not accuse. He did not demand. He asked if I might reconsider, just until things settled. There was something almost respectful in his tone, and that made the refusal harder, but also more important. I told him I had already settled my role. He said nothing for a few seconds. Then he asked what they were supposed to do now. It struck me then how often that question had been asked of me, unspoken, for years. I had answered it every time without being asked, filling gaps before they were acknowledged. This time, I allowed the question to remain where it belonged. I told him they would need to decide that themselves. Boundaries later in life are often mistaken for punishment. They are not. They are recognition, of limits, of time, of the cost of always being available. They are a way of saying that contribution is not an obligation that expires only when one is exhausted. After the calls, I did not feel victorious. I felt aligned. The distance I was creating was not meant to harm them. It was meant to stop harming me. That night, the phone stayed quiet. I knew it would not last. I did not plan it. That matters to say. The memory surfaced on its own, the way the platform does every morning now, an unasked reminder, a prompt shaped like nostalgia. 1 year ago today. The thumbnail showed the front steps of the house I had just left. The light was wrong in the picture, too bright, like a stage. And though it was, still intact, still smiling with borrowed confidence. Robert's post. The words were exactly as I remembered them, unchanged by time or context. Finally, the freeloader is gone. The laughing emoji sat at the end, frozen, confident. Below it, the familiar constellation of approval, family friends, distant cousins, neighbors who had waved at me for decades without knowing my name. Their comments were preserved like insects in amber. About time. Good for you. Must feel like a relief. I stared at the screen longer than necessary. There was no rush. The house around me was quiet, the kind of quiet that doesn't ask you to fill it. I read the comments again, slowly, noticing details I had missed the first time. The assumptions. The certainty. The way everyone spoke as if they had been present for years of private labor, as if they had audited the books of our lives. I did not feel anger. That surprised me. What I felt was distance, clean, measured. The sort that comes after understanding, not before it. I had stepped away from the machinery that turned effort into invisibility. The post, once sharp, now felt brittle. I tapped share. No caption. No explanation. No correction. The platform asked if I wanted to add context. I declined. Context had never helped me before. I posted it as it was, exactly as it had been offered to the world, and set the phone down. Within minutes, the reactions began to change shape. At first, nothing obvious, likes trickling in from people who had missed it the first time. Then a pause. Then comments that didn't know where to land. A question mark from someone who had once praised Robert's strength. A private message I didn't open. Another notification, then another. The reversal was not loud. It was subtle, and therefore more honest. People began to ask when I had moved. How long I had lived there. Someone wrote that they hadn't realized I'd handled the utilities for so long. Another commented, cautiously, that freeloader seemed harsh, considering. Robert noticed. I know he did. His name appeared beneath the post, tagged and untagged, then gone. He did not comment. He sent a message instead. It arrived as a notification I read without opening, the preview enough to tell me the tone had shifted. There was no joke in it. No laughter. The platform had done what platforms do best, preserved a moment long enough for it to be re-examined. Without commentary, the post had lost its shield. It stood alone, exposed to time, stripped of the momentary approval that had made it seem reasonable. I did not respond to anyone. Not to the questions. Not to Robert. The emotional reversal did not come from confrontation. It came from memory, placed back where it belonged, allowed to speak without interruption. The silence I had chosen earlier now framed the words differently. They sounded smaller. Meaner. Less justified. By evening, the post had been shared beyond the circle that had once applauded it. Not mocked. Not attacked. Just seen. And seeing, I have learned, can be enough. I closed the app and made tea. Outside, the day softened into dusk. The house held its quiet. I did not feel the urge to explain myself, to reclaim reputation, to defend years of work that had never been acknowledged. The truth was already there. I had not added a word. I learned what happened to Robert the way I learned most things now, indirectly, without urgency, without being pulled into the center of it. There were no dramatic phone calls, no confrontations staged for resolution. The information arrived quietly, through small fractures in routine. A mutual acquaintance mentioned he had listed the house for sale and then withdrawn it. Someone else noted that the utilities had been transferred again, this time under his name, and promptly flagged for late payment. The systems I had once kept invisible were now visible precisely because they were failing. Robert tried to correct the narrative online. Not directly, never directly. He posted vague statements about misunderstandings and people taking things out of context. The confidence that once anchored his words had thinned. His sentences grew longer, more defensive. He explained too much. That was new. The house itself became a problem he could not posture around. Vendors asked questions he did not know how to answer. Bills arrived with timelines attached. The authority he had assumed came with responsibility he had never practiced. When he called service numbers, he learned what I had always known. Systems do not respond to tone. They respond to records. The social fallout followed a different rhythm. Slower. More personal. People stopped laughing at the old joke. Some unfriended him quietly. Others asked neutral questions that required factual answers. He began attending fewer gatherings, then none. The confidence he once wore like proof now worked against him. Without the structure beneath it, it looked careless. I was not contacted by the bank. I was not summoned by anyone to explain. That, too, mattered. I had removed myself cleanly. My absence was procedural, not emotional. There was nothing left to negotiate. My mother reached out once, not to argue, but to ask if I knew why certain payments were no longer working the way they used to. I told her, calmly, that I had stepped away. She did not ask me to return. She already understood the cost of asking. Robert never apologized. That also mattered. Instead, he sent one final message that attempted balance, acknowledgement without accountability, regret without responsibility. I did not respond. Not because I was waiting for better words, but because the moment for words had passed. The consequences were not punitive. They were structural. Without the unseen labor, the household recalibrated around scarcity. Decisions became visible. Mistakes became expensive. The authority Robert had borrowed dissolved into paperwork he did not understand and timelines he could not outrun. I did nothing to accelerate it. I did nothing to stop it. The quiet that followed was not victory. It was alignment. For the first time in decades, the outcomes matched the contributions. And that, I realized, was all I had ever needed. I did not take anything from him. I simply stopped holding everything together. I am older now than I was when I first learned how to be useful. Not useful in the way people thank you for, but in the quiet way that keeps everything standing. I learned it young, how to notice what needed doing before it was asked for, how to step in where something might fall, how to smooth tension by absorbing it. Over time, that habit hardened into an identity. Reliable. Dependable. Invisible. There is a particular loneliness that comes with that role. You are always present, yet rarely seen. Your value is assumed, not acknowledged. And because you do not demand recognition, people begin to believe you do not need it. Or worse, that you do not deserve it. Aging sharpens that realization. Not because strength disappears, but because patience does. You begin to measure time differently. You ask quieter questions, but more serious ones. How many years do I have left to spend being misunderstood? How much of myself am I willing to give away simply to keep others comfortable? I did not leave in anger. I left in clarity. There was no dramatic moment when everything became obvious. It was gradual, like noticing a draft in a room you've lived in for decades. At first, you ignore it. Then one day, you realize you've been cold for years. Silence had always been my language. I once believed it was kindness. Later, I understood it had also been permission. People filled the quiet with their assumptions. They mistook my steadiness for dependence, my restraint for weakness, my age for irrelevance. Stepping away did not make me smaller. It made the truth larger. I learned something important in the months that followed. Dignity does not announce itself. It does not argue its case. It simply withdraws from places where it is not recognized. And when it does, the imbalance becomes visible to everyone else. For women like me, women who have spent lifetimes holding families together with unpaid labor, emotional steadiness, and quiet sacrifice, the hardest boundary is often the last one. The decision to stop proving our worth through endurance. I did not reclaim my life with noise. I reclaimed it with paperwork, with timing, with restraint. With the calm understanding that self-respect does not require an audience. If there is a lesson here, it is not about revenge. It is about release. It is never too late to stop carrying what was never yours to begin with. I was not a freeloader. I was the structure, and I chose to step away.